Mara Ellison did not notice the moment reality first broke because nothing about it announced itself as important. The research facility was always silent at night, its long corridors designed for maintenance crews who rarely spoke and rarely stayed long enough to feel uneasy. She was walking alone, carrying out a routine inspection through one of the lower storage wings when it happened. There was no sound, no flicker of light, no environmental warning. One step forward and her hand simply stopped existing beyond a certain point in space. It was not severed, not injured, not pulled away. It was as if the world had decided that continuation was no longer allowed past an invisible boundary. She froze instantly, staring at the place where her hand should have been, her mind refusing to interpret what her eyes were showing her. Even breathing felt distant in that moment, like her body was unsure whether she was still fully part of it. When she stepped back, her hand returned exactly as it should be, intact and functional, yet the memory of its absence remained sharp enough to feel like a permanent injury to her understanding of reality. Something had marked that corridor. Something that did not allow matter to proceed beyond a certain unseen line. Dr. Kieran Holt was not a man easily shaken by anomalies. He had spent years working in controlled environments where precision and predictability defined every outcome. So when Mara reported the incident, his first assumption was error, perception failure, fatigue, or environmental distortion. But assumptions collapsed quickly when he witnessed it himself. The metal testing rod was not damaged when extended into the same section of corridor. It did not bend or fracture under force. Instead, it stopped existing halfway through its length with absolute finality. There was no impact, no resistance, no secondary reaction. The rod simply ended, as if the universe had drawn a perfect line and removed everything beyond it from possibility. What disturbed Kieran most was not the disappearance itself, but the precision of it. The boundary was mathematically exact, stretching across the corridor with flawless uniformity, unaffected by material, energy, or measurement. Every instrument failed to register it. Yet everything that crossed it ceased to be real. It was not a wall. It was not a field. It was an absence that behaved like structure. Anya Sorrell arrived under containment authority, trained for anomalies that conventional science refused to categorize. She did not speak much when she first observed the corridor. She simply watched, her attention fixed on the edge where existence stopped behaving normally. After several minutes, she described it in a way neither Mara nor Kieran could forget. The space near the boundary did not feel empty, it felt removed, as though even the concept of space struggled to remain intact there. Light behaved normally until it neared the edge, then seemed uncertain, as if it was approaching something it could not interpret. The most disturbing discovery came from archived surveillance footage. Earlier recordings showed the barrier had not been stationary. It had been moving through the facility for an unknown period of time, erasing sections of corridors, rooms, and structural data without collapse or destruction. Walls did not fall. Doors did not break. They simply ceased to exist, and the world adjusted around the absence without explanation. Even worse, the barrier appeared to be adapting. Its movement followed patterns, as if it was studying the architecture of the station before deciding what to remove next. Evacuation procedures were initiated, but by then the concept of escape had already begun to lose meaning. Maps of the facility no longer matched physical reality. Entire corridors were missing from digital layouts, and emergency routes led into spaces that no longer existed. Mara began noticing something more subtle than structural loss. It was the erosion of certainty within her own memory. She would recall walking through a corridor only to find no evidence it had ever existed. Kieran experienced the same instability, struggling to reconcile what he remembered with what remained. The barrier was not simply consuming matter, it was consuming continuity. Each section it erased did not leave destruction behind, it left absence that replaced history itself. Over time, the station became less like a physical structure and more like a fading idea, slowly losing the ability to prove it had ever been complete. The attempts to communicate with the barrier failed in every measurable way. Sound, light, electromagnetic signals, everything sent toward it ended without return. It did not reflect energy. It did not absorb it. It simply ended it at the boundary as though interaction itself was not permitted. But Mara could not accept that there was nothing beyond it. On her second direct encounter with the edge, she extended her hand again despite warnings. The moment contact occurred, something changed. The barrier responded, not physically, but perceptually. It was as if awareness existed on the other side and had finally acknowledged her persistence. The sensation was not pain or pressure in any human sense, but recognition, like something vast and incomprehensible had briefly turned its attention toward her. For a fraction of a moment, her mind was overwhelmed with impressions that could not be translated into language, only understood as the presence of something observing back. And in that instant, the barrier began to move faster. After the moment of contact, everything inside the station began to change in a way that could no longer be described as gradual. The barrier no longer advanced like an invisible wall drifting through space. It moved with purpose. Sections of the facility that were still intact began disappearing in sharp, impossible cuts, as though reality itself was being sliced cleanly out of existence. Mara, Kieran, and Anya were forced to move through corridors that no longer matched any map or memory, the station becoming less like a structured environment and more like a collapsing thought. Behind them, the air itself seemed to thin, not in pressure or oxygen, but in existence. Floors vanished without debris. Walls ended without damage. Entire sections of engineering space simply stopped being part of reality, leaving behind nothing but continuity where structure used to be. Kieran's calm finally broke as he realized they were not being chased in a physical sense. They were being outpaced by something that did not move through space, but through meaning itself, removing the idea of behind them as easily as it removed matter. The docking bay was never meant to feel like a place of endings, but by the time they reached it, it no longer resembled a functional part of the station. It felt unfinished, as though reality had stopped caring about maintaining it. Mara stood at the center of what remained, aware that escape ships meant nothing if the space around them could no longer be trusted to exist. The barrier surrounded them now, not as a visible shape but as an absolute certainty that nothing beyond a certain limit would continue. Kieran and Anya tried to speak, but even their voices felt uncertain, as though sound itself struggled to remain consistent. Mara understood something then that neither science nor fear had prepared her for. The barrier was not blocking them from escaping. It had been guiding them toward this exact point, compressing their world until only this final space remained. She stepped forward without hesitation. There was no resistance, no impact, no sensation of crossing. Only the immediate, complete erasure of self as she passed into something that did not recognize matter, memory, or identity as valid concepts of existence. And in her final moment of awareness, there was no darkness, no light, only the realization that what they had called empty space was never empty at all.